All right. You guys hear me out there? Thanks, everyone, for coming. This is a larger hall than I'm usually used to. I'm quite proud to be here. I'm glad that I barely avoided having to go up against Chelsea Manning, who was just up in the big hall. So, but in any case, thanks all for coming. So, I'm in this track of this festival called, that's designed around work. We can work it out, it's called. And so the question that it poses is, one of the questions that's posed in the mission statement of this track is they say, adopt a perspective that is located beyond the job market, pure engineering and business administration, and which approaches this future world of work to penetrate it both scientifically and philosophically. And leaving aside the implications of the metaphor of penetrating things, I leave that aside, but I hope that I can sort of give some science and philosophy to this question from my own perspective, which is as a Marxist, a socialist, a sociologist, and also a connoisseur of science fiction to a certain extent. So I'm going to go through what, as I say in the title of this, whose future, meaning like what I want to put in the foreground here is the politics of this question of what is the future of work, what is the relationship between technology and labor, how do political and labor conflicts determine exactly what the outcome is going to be. And so I'm going to talk about, as the subtitle suggests, automation anxiety, the ecological apocalypse, and the struggle for the future or non-future of labor, which I will eventually get to some topics that I address in a book I wrote a while ago, which is sort of what brought me here, but I'm going to get to some other things first of all. So, yes, we can work it out. What is it that we are struggling with? What is it that we are dealing with in terms of contemporary anxieties around work? One of them is what I would call the problem of automation anxiety, this idea that robots are coming to take our jobs, that we are not going to have a place in the economy of the future where it's going to be a handful of Silicon Valley elites and the rest of us have nowhere to go, no way to make a living. And the argument I generally want to push about this is that it's a real anxiety, but it's not a new anxiety. It's a recurrent cyclical anxiety that happens throughout the history of industrial and post-industrial capitalist societies. So here's the current iteration of it. This is from the sort of business author Martin Ford in his book from a couple of years ago, The Rise of the Robots. We're the leading edge of an explosive wave of innovation that will produce robots geared toward nearly every conceivable commercial, industrial, and consumer task. As though this has not been a thing that has concerned workers previously. But let's go back. Automation anxiety from the early 1800s. These would, of course, be the Luddites, the machine breakers, as they were also called, English textile workers who smashed machines because they perceived that those machines were de-skilling their jobs and also taking away their jobs because capitalists were using them to pursue higher profits and lower skilled labor. Now, Luddite and Luddism is often used now as an epithet to refer to people who are perceived to reject technology in some way, that as though Luddism is just, I hate new technology and I hate progress. But that was never actually even what the historical Luddites were about. As the historian Eric Hobsbawm pointed out in his analysis of the Luddites, machine breaking was simply a labor strategy for them. They broke machines, they vandalized the private property of their employers, they did lots of other things, just as workers always do when they're trying to get better wages, better jobs, better dispensations. And so this is not about whether technology is good or bad, it's about who it benefits. Does it benefit the worker or does it benefit the employer? And we can go through the history of cyclical automation anxiety and find the same thing again and again. Here's a figure in American folklore who is known as John Henry, the steel driving man, a former slave who works on the railroad and encounters a new technology called the steam-powered drill, which can work faster and more relentlessly than a human on building the railroad. And John Henry says, I'm going to beat the steam-powered drill. I'm going to outrace the machine. And he does. He wins. He beats the steam-powered drill, and then he drops dead. So this is this metaphor of what happens when humans are put up against machines when they have no other way to earn a livelihood. You know, you go to, this is from Fritz Lang's Metropolis from the 1920s. You come to this figure of humans being reduced to cogs within the machine, that to the extent that humans are still involved in the labor process, that they no longer have any control over it. And in certain hands, such as those of the Italian futurists, this became a sort of fascistic valorization of technology, that this was perceived as progress, as good, but in another way it was, other people, workers perceived it as dehumanizing. And the legacy of this kind of portrayal of technology can be seen going all the way down to movies like The Matrix in the 1990s. The idea that humans are, become simply appendages of the machine rather than the people guiding the machine. And we go down through the years. This is the 1970s. This is an automated or highly robotized car production assembly line, where the promise of the post-World War II order in which you could get a good job in an industrial plant and you would have good wages and you would have a good retirement and you would have a sort of secure life was threatened by this idea that you were going to be, first of all, you were going to have to deal with the speed up and the brutality of faster assembly lines and more mechanized assembly lines, and eventually your job could be eliminated altogether, which is why there are so many fewer workers doing this kind of thing in rich countries in the US and Western Europe than there were a few generations ago. The 1990s, same thing comes again. The jobless future, the end of work, downsizing. A lot of that was blamed on, China or other poor countries taking all the jobs, but a lot of it was also mechanization. And now, here we are with our friend Watson. This is Watson, the IBM computer program winning at Jeopardy, the game show. This is a program that was ultimately, the purpose of which was not just to win gimmicky, game show fights. It was ultimately to do things like process medical records and legal records to replace even kinds of white-collar jobs, even journalism jobs, writers' jobs. Hey, even my job could potentially be automated. So this is this thing this is this anxiety, this idea that we're potentially all being put out of work and being put on the street by robots that can do everything, and then what becomes of us? But here's another side of this story, which is that there's a long tradition both on the left and among even mainstream economists like this man, the famous John Maynard Keynes, of saying, well, isn't the point here that we have all this technology, we have all of this productivity, shouldn't that be turned to the purpose of making our lives easier, making them better, increasing our leisure? He was writing, this is from an essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren that he wrote in the 30s, in which he said, that he predicted that we would be working 3-hour shifts or a 15-hour work week. And the thing he was most concerned about was, well, how are we going to find ways to fulfill ourselves, to enrich ourselves, to figure out what to do with all of this time? He was imagining something like that little guy in the corner is George Jetson. I don't know how many people in this audience are familiar with the Jetsons. It's a cartoon that's fairly well known in the United States anyway. It's a futuristic society where they have flying cars and all that kind of thing. And George here works 2 hours a week and all he has to do is press a button. And that's the kind of thing that people like Keynes back, almost 100 years ago thought would be possible, and in a material sense, it is possible. We are a vastly more productive society than we ever were before, but somehow we can get there. Here's a graph of working hours per week going back to the 19th century in some rich countries, the US, Germany, Belgium, France, the Netherlands. And you can see sort of the legacy of the historical workers' movements for shorter hours, which was once one of the central components of workers' movements. The fight for the 10-hour day, the fight for the 8-hour day, fights that were mostly lost to go to 30-hour weeks or less. But you can see there's a dramatic drop in working hours that then, has declined a little bit since World War II, but not very much. And even that is quite deceptive because this coincides with women working for wages at a much greater rate than was the case before. So the overall amount of wage labor that's being done is much higher. The idea that capitalist productivity could be turned to the cause of leisure has mostly been left by the wayside. And I would say the reason for that is that for the ruling class in the society, for the capitalist class, they don't want to give shorter hours or higher wages. But if they have to do one of the two, higher wages is better, because at least if you don't reduce hours, you can still produce more. And if you can produce more, you can sell more and you can accumulate more. And so there has been this persistent tendency to resist any call to turn the increased productivity of the society into more leisure and more time for the workers, for the masses. But then there's another problem. Because the rhetoric around automation and robotization and artificial intelligence and so on runs up against a basic statistical problem, which is that the economic statistics don't actually bear out this idea that the robots are all coming rapidly to take all our jobs. This here is from a recent robotics event where they tried to make a robot walk down the stairs like a human, which is actually a very hard thing to do, and the robot fell on its face and ended up like that. And so there's a persistent critical perspective on this whole question of rapid productivity increase and robotization and automation, which is that we aren't actually seeing it. This graph comes from The Economist. There's many different versions of this story, which basically shows the rate of productivity growth. Now, if the robots were coming to take all our jobs, you would expect to see that reflected in statistics in the growth of productivity. That is, how much can you produce, how much can you output per hour of human labor? And the reality is we don't see that. We see stagnating productivity growth. And so then the question becomes, well, why is that? And there are there's a whole cottage industry of people trying to come up with reasons why this is. Maybe we're not measuring productivity correctly. Maybe there's some great productivity growth that's happening that we're not seeing. Maybe actually all this supposed great innovation is not actually that great compared to things like the internal combustion engine that really did have dramatic impacts on human societies. Maybe some innovations are negative from the point of view of economic productivity, More opportunities for people to surf the internet at their desks instead of working. Maybe we just haven't seen the impact yet. We know that in the Great Depression, there was a lot of economic innovation that did not pan out until years later, so it was not immediately apparent. And maybe we need new policies. Maybe it just has to do with changes in demographics. But there's one thing, and this gets back to my central point that I want to make here. There's one point that economists, mainstream economists anyway, are very reluctant to come to, even though I think it's basically the most obvious one, which is not about the impact of technology on workers. It's about the impact of workers on technology. So here I have a couple of different quotes, which you don't have to read the whole thing. The first one is from Italian Marxist named Mario Tronti. The second is from a contemporary heterodox economist in the United States named Josh Mason. Both of them, however, are making the same essential point. And it's one that you could essentially derive from an economics 101 textbook, which is that if you're thinking about a situation that will either incentivize or not incentivize the development of more efficient, labor-saving kinds of technologies in the workplace, one of the essential questions you have to ask is, well, what is the situation of the workers in those workplaces? Because if the workers are cheap and the workers are easy to control, they don't have unions, they don't have the ability to fight back, they know that they can be replaced by somebody else off the street if they speak up, well, then no reason not to just use those cheap workers. But once those workers become expensive and ornery and organized, well then that's when the robot starts to seem more appealing. Right, so as Josh Mason says, the incentive to substitute capital for labor is stronger when workers are scarce and wages are rising. It's very simple, it's economics 101, but it's very rarely brought into our discussions about what the relationship actually is between automation and technology and robotics and algorithm and all of that and labor organizing and the power of labor. And on the flip side, there is, I think, sometimes on the left, a tendency to say, to just say all these technologies are just tools that capital uses to oppress labor, and that is in many cases true. But it's also a failure to reckon with this fact that a strong working class is a working class that is capable of essentially making the boss want to replace them with robots, and we should be honest about that. And rather than saying, that we should ban the robots or tax the robots, as Bill Gates has said, we should say, okay, then how does that surplus get redistributed? How does the benefit of a potentially more productive economy get distributed? Is it going to go to the masses of people, or is it going to go to a handful of the owners of the robots? Which is what has been happening. This is from the United States, but you can see this in other countries. This is the disjunction between the rise in productivity, which, though it has been somewhat stagnant in recent years, we've continued to become a more and more productive economy, but the wages of workers have completely separated from that. So it was, you can see up until the early 70s, as productivity rose, wages rose. But then after that, this ceased to be the case. And the reasons for that, I think, I would argue, are largely political. They have to do with the fact that there are no longer strong political parties and unions and social movements that could demand their share of rises in productivity. And so we got this. And that is where we find ourselves today, and in some ways the society that we find ourselves in is one in which technology produces profits for the elite, and it also is used not necessarily to save labor, but simply to control it. What this image represents is a story that came out recently, some of you may have seen, about the use of brain monitoring devices in Chinese workers. It's used elsewhere, but it's become more common in China. So these, the workers may have devices in their helmets which monitor their brain activity. And of course, this is described as something that's meant to make sure that someone who's in a bad mood or is having trouble can be taken off the line, and for safety and all these things. But really, it's just a way to control workers in the same way that an algorithm that, this is a thing that's often done in the service sector. You can have an algorithm to schedule your workers when their shifts are going to be. which means that the workers never know when they're going to be working, which if you have children or you have any other kinds of obligations, never knowing how many hours you're going to get or what shift you're going to have is terrible. But from the standpoint of the boss, that's great. None of these things are really increasing productivity in the sense that they're doing a lot to replace human labor with machinery, but what they are doing is simply intensifying and cementing the power of the boss. So we have to think about that as well, the degree to which the future of work is it's not just a question of are workers going to be replaced, but in what ways are workers going to be controlled? In what ways are they going to be able to exercise power? I personally am, in general, in favor of replacing human labor power with machines to the extent that that's possible. This is one of my favorites from Oscar Wilde's The Soul of Man Under Socialism, which he says somewhat bluntly that civilization requires slaves, and then goes on to say that, of course, Greek slavery, human slavery, is a horrible thing, but mechanical slavery, the slavery of the machine, on that the future of the world depends. And so the question becomes, do the machines produce for us a future of leisure, or do they simply produce another form, another way in which we can be oppressed? Which again, is the machinery going to be used to liberate us from labor, or simply to subordinate us to it? Now, that's only one piece of the puzzle. I haven't even gotten to the ecological question, which is also in the subtitle, so I should mention it. I use the term the metabolic rift. So this is the question of whatever machines can do, whatever automation can do for us, whether it can liberate us from labor or not. What about climate change? What about resource scarcity? What about what's happening to the planet? And the concept of the metabolic rift comes from the Marxist sociologist John Bellamy Foster, who in turn drew it from Marx and other 19th century socialists. And it's this idea that we have created a world where there's this disjunction between how we live as a human society and the metabolism of the natural world, the way in which resources are used and then returned to the earth. This image is from the science fiction movie Wall-E, which about 10 years ago or so was a movie about basically a world that is just full of garbage that the humans have had to abandon because they have messed it up so badly. And the Metabolic Rift story kind of leads to this, but it leads to this sort of science fictional point, but it begins from the 19th century, which is why it kind of arose from this. Karl Marx was influenced by the German chemist Justus von Liebig, who was analyzing scenes like this from Victorian London, in which essentially the problem of ecology in 19th century Britain was the problem of the maldistribution of shit. Which is to say, in an agrarian society, people grow food, they eat food, they deposit their compost and also their feces back into the land, which then restores the fertility of the soil, allowing a sort of cycle of nutrition and nutrients and agriculture. Industrialization meant lots of people were moving to the city, which then meant that they were coming to the city, they were eating things that were grown in the country, their shit was going into the streets of Victorian London rather than back into the soil in the countryside, and so that meant diminished soil fertility, that meant it was much harder to sustainably grow crops, and it was that rather than overpopulation or any of these kind of things that Malthus and his followers ever after would like to say. It was this rift between the country and the city that was the real problem, and we live now in a world that is the product of this metabolic rift, and I think it is we are so far into this rift that I don't see how we escape it exactly. This is an image of the nitrogen cycle. So the whole problem of soil fertility comes down to the element nitrogen, which is sort of like essential to plant growth, and it needs to be fixed in the soil. In pre-industrial societies, nitrogen fixation happened sometimes through lightning storms and then, the recycling of waste back into the soil. But in our society, we dealt with the problem I just described, the problem of the metabolic rift, by coming up with industrial nitrogen fixation, which uses primarily, historically, has used fossil fuels to create commercial fertilizers that make it possible to make up for the fact that the soil nutrients are being depleted. And so now we find ourselves in a world where we've essentially we've altered our relationship to the natural world so much that it's, I think, futile and facile to imagine that we can just sort of go back to the sort of sustainable world of our ancestors, rather than just thinking about managing the climate, managing the natural world. So, all this is to say then, we are living in a world of Frankenstein's monster. I take this figure, or this sort of argument, from the sociologist Bruno Latour in his reading of the story of Frankenstein's monster, which is to say that Frankenstein's error was not to make the monster. And in fact, he didn't make a monster. He made something that he refused to love and care for, just as we have refused to love and care for the natural world that we have endlessly manipulated and now must continue to manipulate if we are to survive as a species. So, here we are in the metabolic rift. This being, of course, climate change. Climate change. So here we go. Back to where we started. Work. Where does work fall into all this? How do we deal with the potential, and not necessarily the reality of labor-saving technologies, and also the limitations, the ecological limitations placed upon us? I think we need to think, first of all, about what work is, or what we think it is. Often these questions about the future of work, they become bound up in these sort of conflations of different ideas of what work actually is. So here's one idea of what work is. It's things that are necessary to the reproduction of society. That might mean sweeping the streets, or it could mean something like the raising of an education of children. So this is like the things we think somebody needs to do, or in some cases that a machine needs to do if that's possible or desirable. Then there's work. It's the thing you do to get a paycheck, no matter what it is, even if it's ultimately a destructive activity. You could be doing anything but it's work as long as you're getting paid for it. And in the United States, at least, there's been a lot of debate over the question of a job guarantee, the idea that the government should create a job for anybody who wants one, without really considering what the content of that job is going to be. And then finally, there's work in the sense of something that requires some self-sacrifice and some discipline, and that gives you fulfillment, but isn't necessarily either socially necessary or a source of income. This particular image is just comes from my own personal interest. This is Scarlett, one of the best. She's a professional video game player, one of the best StarCraft 2 players in the world. Makes some money at it, but ultimately sacrificed an immense amount in order to do something that clearly is neither socially necessary nor as rewarding as other things she could have done. So I put to you then that the matrix of things we need to be considering is the sort of, I'm going to give you the work cube. It's got the three axes here. Is it necessary labor or is it superfluous in the sense that we could get along without it? Is it paid or is it unpaid? Is it something that people find inherently fulfilling or inherently tedious? And obviously this is a spectrum, but you can sort of abstractly talk about things that occur in the different regions of the cube. So it could be necessary and paid and also tedious, like the people who are going to clean the toilets here. It could be necessary and paid, but also fulfilling. Scientists, or academics maybe would fall into that category. It could be necessary but unpaid, and also tedious. Much of the work of changing diapers is often done by mostly women, not for money. It could be necessary and unpaid, but fulfilling, which then when you get to play with the child after you change the diaper, maybe that falls into that category. Necessary, unnecessary, paid, tedious. I've done jobs like this. Rejecting, well, this is a very American example, but in the United States, there are a lot of people, and I've had this job, whose job it is to essentially reject people's applications for health insurance because they're sick. That is socially completely unnecessary. It's paid, and boy is it tedious, as well as being soul-destroying. You can do things that are unnecessary, that are paid, but that are fulfilling, which I guess me standing up here giving this speech would fall into that category. Unnecessary, unpaid, also tedious would be things like the kinds of paperwork you have to do for taxes or other kinds of government bureaucracies that could potentially be simplified. And finally, the unnecessary, the unpaid, and yet the fulfilling. Well, masturbation is the obvious example of that, but one can think of others. Video games, whatever it is. So, where does this leave us with regard to, we can work it out. What are we going for? And I would submit that in the intersection between the possibility of automation and the necessity of grappling with the ecological crisis, we come to something that is in this quote from Karl Marx that I write here, the question of disposable time, meaning that we take our wealth in the form of time and in the form of non-commodified activity, rather than simply thinking of it in terms of having more stuff, essentially. Because that is both ecologically sustainable, and it is a way for us to think about recapturing productivity growth, not just in the form of higher wages, although I think that that's a valuable demand, but in the form of time, of more time. And this brings me then finally to which I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm just going to have to jump through, but this is a book I wrote, which tries to work through a lot of these issues using both social science but also science fiction to think about where do we go, given that we will either be more or less constrained by the environmental crisis, but also that there is a class struggle, there's a political question of, is there going to continue to be a small economic elite that determines, that monopolizes resources and determines how resources are distributed, or are we going to have a kind of egalitarian society in one way or another? And so this is, I can only very quickly kind of step through it, but this is the idea. So that top axis there, ecology, is sort of scarcity on one side, abundance on the other. So scarcity meaning specifically ecological scarcity, meaning that our habitats are degraded, our resources are running out. We have to figure out how much we can consume sustainably. Abundance being more like something like, Star Trek, for those who have seen that show, where there's kind of a machine called the replicator that can make anything you want. There's an antimatter source of energy that can give you anything you want. And that allows you to kind of get away from the ecological contradiction. In our world, that would maybe also come down to, we're off carbon. We're on solar, we're on wind, we're on geothermal. Beyond that, we've found ways to clean up environmental damage. That's that axis. And then the other is the equality versus hierarchy kind of axis. In other words, is it like this world in which there's a 1% and a 99%, to use the terminology that came out of the Occupy movement in the United States, or is it going to be a more egalitarian society in which whatever we have or don't have, it's sort of shared out equally? And so this goes into then these sort of four ideal types. You interact these two terms and you get these different kind of, they're intentionally simplified, and in some sense, the whole point of the exercise is that, as William Gibson once said, the future is already here. It's just unequally distributed. These are just ways of intensifying and extrapolating aspects of our present, as the best science fiction always does, in order to think about where the tendencies are, where the good and bad tendencies are in the way we're living now. So, what I call communism, not in the sense of the Soviet Union, but in the sense of Star Trek as depicted here, is that from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, where we play out different questions of what would we do and what kind of conflicts and what kinds of struggles would we have if we weren't worried about the day-to-day, like hustling to make a living, making money, working for someone else. And I do think there are a lot of questions that still arise in terms of our status hierarchies, in terms of racism and gender and things of that, like that. You can see it in sort of the little pockets of pseudo-communism, like Wikipedia, which is full of exactly these kinds of conflicts and hierarchies, even though it's not exactly what you would call a capitalist order. I don't have time to go through the capitalist road to communism, so I'll come back to it if somebody wants to know how this graph basically is a thought exercise about how the universal basic income can lead to communism. I'll come back to it if somebody wants the explanation, or I can talk to you about it afterwards. But basically, so my second thought experiment is this idea that, we can have a post-work society or a post-labor society, but one that still has a capitalist ruling class, and how do they maintain their power? And this is what I call rentism, which is the form in which intellectual property in particular is used to control access to not just information, as we see now with music and books and movies, where you can be prosecuted for copying things without authorization, but that in fact, if you lived in a world that had something like Star Trek's replicator, a thing that could just, basically a 3D printer, but, times 1 million, that could just make anything, then you could potentially be guilty of a violation for making anything that you didn't have a license to. And at the limit point, you live in a society in which that's the entire economy, in fact, because there isn't human labor involved in production so much anymore. It's just, we have these machines that could, in principle, make anything we want, but in practice, only make the things that we have a license to. And here's a real-world example of this, the John Deere tractor, which it's a tractor, right? But it has a lot of complex software in it, and it is, in fact, not legal for the farmers that own these tractors or own these tractors to modify the software, to hack their tractors, essentially. Because they don't technically own the tractors, they just license them, and they're only allowed to modify them in certain ways. And so they are subject to the licensing regime, even at the level of agriculture, right? It's subject to the licensing regime. Here's a new one that this is a recent story. This guy who's mainly involved in recycling e-waste recently lost a court judgment against Microsoft because he was distributing restored disks for like Microsoft Windows systems on refurbished computers, and they took him to court because they said he was violating their license, even though he wasn't making money off it or anything. So it's this kind of it's this kind of world. Third, we have the socialist concept, which again this is back to the egalitarian side, where we're talking about a world where you don't have this kind of oppressive ruling class, but then we still have to deal with the ecological crisis. And so there's a couple different I think ideas to pursue here. One of which, I guess the one I'll say, the big one, because I need to wrap up quickly here. This image is from Kim Stanley Robinson's science fiction novels, Red Mars, Blue Mars, Green Mars, which are about the terraforming of Mars to make it habitable for humans, which are they're excellent books and they're based on a lot of research. But I think they're most useful and interesting, not as literally guides to going to Mars. I don't think we're going to Mars anytime soon. But more as guides to, in a way, terraforming our own planet. As I had said earlier, the sort of metabolic rift is such that we are going to have to actively not just withdraw from messing around with nature, although in certain ways, of course, we have to, like not spewing any more carbon into the atmosphere, but we're going to have to actively manipulate it. And so the concept of geoengineering, this idea that we could actively take steps to mitigate the impact of climate change, some of which are fairly low-key and simple, like just planting more trees, or maybe having technologies for sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, but some of which are more radical, like spraying particles into the upper atmosphere to block sunlight in order to reduce the amount of solar energy that warms up the planet. And I don't sort of make a brief specifically for any of those, because I think they're all, the more radical you get with them, the more dangerous they are, and there's tons of unintended consequences possible there. But I think if we're thinking seriously about what I would call the eco-socialist future, in which we maintain an Earth that can sustain all the people that currently live on it, rather than just a small elite, we have to think in these terms. Skip past some of this stuff. To get to my final point, this idea of the final quadrant, where we live in an ecologically scarce world and a hierarchical one with a small ruling class elite, which is why I sort of raised the point about eco-socialism, because if you don't think about how do you sustain the entire population, and you think about a world that is heavily automated, in which there's less need for human labor, where you get is to a world where the rich can essentially run away and hide from all of the rest of us. This is, it's the world where they have their robots or their humans turned into robots, as with our friend RoboCop here. And the rest of us are left outside. They are left in places like this track, which is from northern Minnesota, where refugees trying to flee the Trump administration are trying to get into Canada. And you get the entire industry that you see in various ways where the rich are trying to get away from the rest of us. And some of this takes kind of ludicrous forms, like people in Silicon Valley who think that they can move to oil rigs and not depend on the government and not depend on anybody, which is just, I think, a sort of delusional way of thinking about, rich people basically, the hubris of rich people thinking that they actually are not dependent on society when in fact they are. But nevertheless, you see it in gated communities, you see it in the construction of private islands, you see it in things like this. Is a recent, an example of a company that's dedicated to providing a service for rich people to get on boats and flee when something goes wrong, because there's this inherent fear that the masses are going to revolt, are going to take revenge. I think it's a recognition on some level by the ruling class that there is something wrong, that massive inequality is a problem, that the unequal effects of ecological crisis is a problem, and that they do have something to be afraid of. And what scares me is that this particular interaction between automation and between automation and an extremely class stratified society produces a situation that's a bit different than the one we might have seen in the capitalism of 100 or 200 years ago, because there isn't the mutual interdependence of capital and labor. In other words, what the motor of so much of capitalist history has been this idea that the workers depend on capitalists while capitalists also depend on workers. In other words, the workers don't have any other way to make a living, and so we have to work for people. Capitalists need people to run the shops and the factories and so on, and so they depend on the workers in a certain way, which is why strikes work, which is why, the Luddites smashing, machinery works, because the workers are necessary to the process. But if you can automate them away, then you can end up in a situation like this where there's just a lot of surplus populations, people who are incarcerated, people who are in refugee camps, people who are dying of preventable diseases, right? It's genocidal in its logic, even though it doesn't have to look like the genocides we're familiar with from the 20th century. It's simply a lot of people being, from the standpoint of the ruling class, surplus. So that's the kind of the final and depressing moment. And we have a bit more time. I'm going to close, as I try to always do, with after doing the super depressing bit, with the more uplifting bit, where I, again, try to emphasize the point that that there is still a very important role for politics and for labor struggle. This particular image, again, forgive me for my being parochial, but this is an American image. This is the Fight for 15, which is the fight for a $15 minimum wage being undertaken by service sector workers, primarily in the United States, which is $15 an hour is not very much, but it's about twice what the legal minimum wage is in the United States. And it goes back to the point I was making earlier, that it is fights like this that drive technological dynamics and political dynamics forward. One of the responses that you often get from employers and from their apologists in the press when confronted with things like the Fight for 15 is, oh, well, if you get $15 an hour, then you're just going to be replaced with machines. There's a machine that can flip burgers now, and there's automated checkout kiosks and all this kind of thing. And I think the point I want to make is that we should, rather than trying to refute that, we should accept it. But we should accept it and then say, okay, if the fight for $15 an hour is going to lead to replacing burger flippers with robots, that's fine, because who really wants to flip burgers? The question then becomes, who benefits from that? To whom does the increased social wealth of automating burger flipping accrue? Is it going to just be a handful of stockholders and owners, or is it going to be to those workers who are displaced and to all the other people that are working for low wages? And so that, I guess, is where I want to leave it, is to say that there are these broader dynamics, the ecological dynamics, the technological dynamics, but that ultimately what we're looking at is a political question. What kind of society are we going to live in? How is it going to be structured? Who is going to benefit and who is going to lose out? Who is going to pay the costs? Who is going to reap the benefits? And yeah, that's the intervention that I want to make in this conversation, in this discussion about work and technology and ecology and all of that. Thank you. Yeah.
Das Mikrofon. Ja, wer jetzt Fragen hat, Q&A, ein bisschen Zeit haben wir noch, gleich hier vorne.
Yes, hello, my name is Daniel, and you wanted, I think, a question about universal basic income, so here it comes. Yesterday, at 1st of May, the leader of the biggest German trade union said it is payment to people to get people out of work. Now, Without going into that aspect, you talked about class struggle. How would you look at universal basic income in the sense of empowering people to say no to certain jobs, certain job conditions?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked the basic income question because I sort of glossed over it. So basic income is, I don't know, people probably know in the room, but universal basic income meaning the provision of a baseline level of income completely independent of all work requirements, all other requirements, which has been discussed for decades but has become in recent years more, I suppose, popular both on the right and the left as a concept. And I guess I would say, like, I've always been in favor of it for the reason that it establishes the principle that in a rich society, people just have a basic right to a level of living independent of requirements, and it frees people from the bureaucratic strictures of applying for things, meeting caseworkers, jumping through various hoops to get your benefit. And so in that sense, I think it's important both because it improves people's lives, but also because it instantiates a principle, which is, to me, like a post-work principle. The idea that there's nothing inherently good about showing up somewhere and working for somebody else for a paycheck. However, especially in recent years, I think it's important to distinguish between a right and left version of this demand and of this proposal. On the left, it takes the form I just described. It's a way of replacing various means-tested, sort of like paternalistic programs with something that is just unconditional. However, on the right, it sometimes takes the form of an attempt to undermine existing social rights like housing rights, healthcare, education, that we can say, oh, we can just get rid of all of those things and just hand people checks, which is bad for a couple of reasons. One, because, of course, the amount that you're going to end up with in the end is going to be less. That's the whole point, is to take away all these benefits and replace it with less. But then the other thing is that it denies the reality that certain kinds of things, this is almost the communist principle, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. Our needs are not equal. So when you're talking about something like healthcare, where you and I, depending on our age, depending on whether we have a disease, depending on all kinds of other things, a woman needs, care if she's pregnant, our needs for healthcare are not the same. And so handing everyone a check of the same amount and saying, go buy some healthcare, that's not an egalitarian solution. And I think that's the right-wing versions of basic income tend in that direction. So I'm still a proponent of basic income, but I think it's become increasingly important to make that political distinction.
So, are there any more questions? Please raise your hand. Wir hätten noch Zeit für ein oder zwei Fragen, aber im Moment sieht es nicht so aus. Aber Peter hat bestimmt auch gleich noch Zeit hinter der Bühne. So, Peter, for now, thank you very much.
Thank you.